All right. So before we get going, a couple things off the top. So we will start this week on module 5 and 6. I kind of combine these two chapters. I'll even mention once we get to the point, we'll cover module 5 basically in the first 20 minutes of class. So that module 5 reading, I had a couple people reach out. I tried to respond. If not, I'll probably catch that when I'm cleaning out my inbox after class today. It was not for points, right? Which is why if we're looking at the assignments tab, right, I set that to be under the ungraded tab. It's simply set to be for review, okay? Now, module 6 is an assignment that is for points. And I put up an announcement on Thursday, not due at the usual ones at the end of the day on Monday, because that we didn't have time to talk about it during the exam. And that module 6 reading is not due until the end of the day tomorrow. So if you haven't done it yet, you can still get on and get it done by the end of the day tomorrow for full points. We'll cover the bulk of module 6 on Thursday anyway, so I'm not as worried about you being kind of primed for those topics today. I'm more focused on you being primed on Thursday, so that assignment is due at the end of the day tomorrow. Okay. I will also tomorrow at some point, and I'll accompany this with an announcement, and we'll talk more in depth about it on Thursday, but I'm going to get the next Canvas discussion up. So it'll be related to the material that we cover on Thursday, which is why I'll then kind of discuss it, pull open the data sources, and we'll talk a little more in depth about that in Thursday's class. So those are the kind of things to start looking out for. We will start with down here, the module 5 slides today. Where are they at? There they are. We'll kind of have in-class quizzes. We're kind of back to the old routine. Okay, module quiz posted after class on Thursday. CL sessions resumed this Thursday, next Monday, to cover the material that we covered this week. In terms of the exam, right? So I might have switched some things off just to not confuse anyone, but after class today, I'll change it a little bit. So when I grade these, it uploaded kind of the number you got correct. I didn't want anyone to think, if they got 12, it wasn't 12%, it was 12 out of 25, whatever it is. So I uploaded, I might have these hidden on the grade book, the number you got correct. What I do have down here and being weighted according to the syllabus, that 22.5%, is what your midterm exam grade was as a percent. Okay? So I think if you look at the syllabus, you can scale this up to be at 200 points and then do a point calculation. But it's probably easier to think about what my grade is as a percent. I will tomorrow also get something posted with an accompanying announcement, which is like a hypothetical grade tool. I'll kind of have a description of how to use it. I'll revisit it at the beginning of class on Thursday. Basically, you start to plug things in that you see for your specific grade on Canvas to kind of figure out what you need to do on the next 2 exams to get the desired grade you want in this class. So another change that I'm going to make when I get back to my office after class. I currently have this being weighted as 22.5%. What your exams end up being is a larger percentage of your overall grade, right? It's not just 1 exam, it's 3. So I'm going to change things on the grade book. So it will show you what your current grade would be if you scored just the same on the next 2 exams. So if you didn't do well, it's going to give you kind of a worst case scenario, right? But it gives you a little bit more idea of kind of an accurate representation of where you're currently at in the class if you continue to perform the same on the next 2 exams as you did on the first. Now, full transparency, the final actually, I was looking back at some of the data, typically tends to have the highest average in this class. There's probably various reasons. People probably buckle down a little bit more for the final, you have a little bit more time. But, thinking about kind of showing you what your grade would be if you did just as well on the next exam on the final as what you did in the first exam, it probably is like I would interpret it as kind of a worst case scenario, if you didn't do as well as you wanted, okay? So you'll see that kind of change on Canvas. So your grade will kind of update from what it previously was, just to kind of, but I didn't want to freak anyone out. So I just wanted to describe to you why it's going to be displayed to you that way on Canvas. I'll also get up that hypothetical grade tool so that you can play around. Okay, what if I do better on the next 2 exams? What would my final grade be in the class? And it's also time to mention grades previous to the exam were very high. Why? Because all those categories, the discussions, the quizzes, the in-class quizzes, those are all ways to get easier points and help increase your grade if you don't do as well in the exams. So continuing to kind of keep your grades in those categories high will help your final grade in the class. The CL points aren't added in, right? I'll actually get those uploaded later today to kind of show you what your current kind of grade is in those CL tenants, but they're not added into your grade until the end of the semester. So that should be all of the things related to the exam, kind of where we're currently at before we jump into material. There is one more thing I want to mention about the exam before I do. Any questions over anything I've set up to this point? Okay, I'll also get it adjusted to make sure you should be able to this afternoon view kind of your scan or which questions you got wrong. If you do want to review or kind of come in and ask some questions, I can't sit down and work, for an hour with every single person. But if you do want to stop by and look at kind of which ones you got wrong, maybe work through a couple that you really weren't sure on, you can always stop by office hours. I have office hours tomorrow. I have office hours next week. All right, so those are a great time to kind of come in and review those concepts because everything we do, and we'll see today, I think already, everything we're doing is just building on what we've already talked about. All right, so it's really important to kind of have a good understanding of what we covered in the first 4 weeks because we're just going to keep building on it. So coming by office hours is going to be a really good time to review that either tomorrow. Once again, it doesn't have to be tomorrow, right? It could be next week on Monday or Wednesday. If there's a specific time, I am sometimes available on Fridays to schedule something for short amounts of time. So if that's the case, feel free to reach out to me via email. But, I'll be honest, the week before the exam, I probably could count on my two hands how many people stop by during office hours. Right? I have them for a reason. I would really suggest trying to utilize them more and not just the week before the exam, but kind of every week to kind of review the concepts and material leading up to these. So please start using those more. I think for the people that have been using them, hopefully it's been beneficial and you can kind of see that play out in the exam. Other than that, you guys actually did better than the other section. But across the two sections, I have an idea about where I want the average to be. It was a little bit low. I don't like to do this because I don't like to set up expectations for future exams because this likely, based off my prior experience, won't be the case for the next two exams. I'm going to put a slight straight curve on this exam. So it's just going to be a 2 points added to everyone's grade. So when I upgrade those exam scores this afternoon, it's not a big curve, but it's a 2-point curve, so a 2 percentage point curve. It'll increase grades just a little bit, and it puts the average kind of right where exactly I wanted to see it be. So you guys were really close to where I want it to be, just a little bit under. So I'm going to kind of have that 2-point curve. Okay. Other than that, I think I've mentioned everything housekeeping wise. Any questions for me before we dive into material? Like I said, I know that's not much. I'm sure you want to hear like a 20-point curve or something like that, but I do want to see that kind of mean where I wanted it to be. It was a little bit lower, and so that's kind of what I'm going to do. So you'll see I update this, and I'll probably call this midterm exam number 1 with curve, so that it has the kind of built in, so you can see what that score is. Okay. All right. So there's no questions at this point. Class is going to be a little bit clunky today because this thing is not working for me unless I can pull it open on Zoom, but I can't get it to display. So we're still going to use it, but it's going to be a little bit clunkier than usual. And I'll probably forget once or twice to not use this and switch to it on Zoom. But we're going to start out really talking about something we've already discussed. Okay. So we kind of had it, and I mentioned this a little bit, but to kind of connect the dots, we talked about allocated efficiency first of all with the production possibilities. Right? And we're saying it's going to be the point where the marginal benefit of the last unit is equal to the marginal cost. When we're looking at markets, what does supply represent? Producers, marginal costs, and demand represented consumers, marginal benefits. So when we were talking about the equilibrium price and quantity, we were really talking about the allocated efficient point of the market. Okay? So this allocated efficient point of the market, right, is simply where that supply curve is equal to the demand curve, or the last unit was where that marginal benefit was equal to the marginal cost. Okay? So we're then going to start to kind of define this word of surplus. So before we go through it in the slides, I think the slides are a nice summary. Excuse me. And this is where I already forgot and tried to switch over on here. So see if I can get this to work. There we go. So we don't want to see me. We want this set to be here. Okay. So I'll work through this and then we'll kind of return to the slides, and it has broken down in a slightly different context. So if we're thinking about a market and we are currently in equilibrium, or we're thinking about we're at the allocative efficient point. Okay. So that's going to be where my supply curve is equal to my demand curve. So I'll start writing things out a little bit differently today occasionally. But this equilibrium price, we can also, in quantity, is also like our allocatively efficient price and quantity. Now, no, it's a little bit less clear because I have to use it through Zoom today. If anything's not, it's too fuzzy and you have questions, please ask questions, let me know, right? But this was our market, okay? So we're going to talk about something called economic surplus. So all surplus means, this is where it gets weird. We can talk about surplus or shortages when it comes to the number of units. But when we talk about economic surplus, that's just simply the difference between the marginal benefit and the marginal cost of that unit. So if you want to think about it as like the first unit, if demand represents marginal benefits, supply represents marginal cost, the surplus of that first unit is the difference between the two. And then the surplus of the second unit would be the difference between the marginal cost and the marginal benefit for the second unit, and third and fourth and so on, up to the point where the market stops at that equilibrium or the allocated efficient quantity. So total economic surplus, we're not going to have to break this down integer by integer because we have these nice linear curves. Essentially, we can look at the difference between any fraction of these quantities. So our total economic surplus is going to be the difference between the marginal costs and the marginal benefits of this market, which is simply the difference between our supply and demand curve. Okay. Now, if instead we want to break this down, so I know this is off the screen, but I'm wanting to give people a little bit of time here. So here, if I'm looking at my quantity and price, and let's say I've got my supply curve, I've got my demand curve. Remember, this was how I calculated economic surplus. Okay. If I'm at this equilibrium or allocatively efficient price and quantity, we can also break this down into two categories, right? Consumer and producer surplus. So the sum of consumer and producer surplus will give us total surplus. Those are the only two people in the market, consumers and producers. So if we think about we'll start with consumer. Consumer surplus, that's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs to consumers, right? Surplus, economic surplus, if you want to think about consumer economic surplus. But what represents the marginal benefit to consumers? The demand curve. What is the marginal cost when you buy something? Talked about this in previous module. This is where we just keep building, so we're not going to spend as much time usually on these concepts. When you go to the store and buy something, the marginal cost to you is the price, right? So we've got our demand curve. The difference between that and the equilibrium price represents consumer economic surplus, right? So we've got consumer surplus, and we're thinking about a market without government intervention. We'll eventually later today get to government intervention, but if it's just left alone, that consumer surplus will always be a triangle that's on top. It's not the most technical way of remembering it, but the reason why is because when we look at the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of consumers, their marginal benefit is represented by the demand curve. Their marginal cost is whatever that current equilibrium price is. Okay? Now, instead, we think about what about producers? What is producer surplus? Well, it's going to be the difference between the marginal cost and the marginal benefit for every unit, but for producers. What is the marginal benefit when I sell something? If I sell a product, the amount of money I receive is the price I'm selling it for. This is where we have to put ourselves in the minds of companies. The marginal benefit when I sell something is the current equilibrium price. What represents my marginal cost as a producer? the supply curve. These should be concepts we already know. We've talked about this. So that difference will represent producer surplus, or where would that be visually? The area below my price, but above my supply curve. So consumer surplus will always be on top. Producer surplus will always be on the bottom. Okay? Kind of just like with the supply and demand, right? Supply always starts out lower than where the demand curve starts out. Might be another way to remember this. So what is total economic surplus? It's just the sum of these two things. So we can take total surplus and break it down into both producer and consumer surplus. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? We want to have a good base understanding because we're just going to complicate this here in a second. Okay. All right. So, kind of already discussed these things, but a more technical way of writing this is when we find consumer surplus, it's looking at every single unit, the difference between the marginal benefit, marginal cost of consumers, which was the marginal benefit represented by the demand curve, and the price, and add that up for every single unit. Now, visually, that was just this kind of area above price, below the demand curve. What is this the shape of? Triangle. So let's think about if I want to start calculating consumer surplus, how do I find the area of a triangle? 1/2 times base times height, right? Should be relatively easy calculations. We'll get to some graphs where we have to do this in a second. But unless kind of, if we're thinking about non-mathematically, it's the area above price but below our demand curve. If I want to find consumer surplus, what should I be using to do that? Part of that equation is the demand curve. Now, producer surplus, right? I kind of have, I'll skip ahead here, is the exact opposite, right? Where I'm going to look at every single unit, still the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost, but now for producers. So now what is the marginal benefit? Marginal benefit is the price. So area below the price but above our supply curve would represent our producer surplus. We kind of already had that drawn out, but here's just kind of a summary of that. Now, if I wanted to calculate consumer surplus, right? Let's assume I told you the equilibrium price is 40. So my consumer surplus is the area below demand but above the price. How would I find the area of this triangle? What is the height? Going from 100 to 40, so my height is 60. At that equilibrium price, my quantity is 50. 50 times 60 is 3,000. That's my consumer surplus, right? What did I forget to do? Multiply it by 1/2. It's always going to be, we keep these nice linear demand curves. It's always the area of a triangle, right? So I should get consumer surplus is 1,500. Any question on that calculation? I know we're going through it relatively quick, but I want to save some time for some more difficult concepts. Okay. Now I can do the same thing with producer surplus. I guess the animation's turned off here, but it's the same thing. It's the area of a triangle, right? It's just now that triangle is on the bottom. So the area in between my supply curve and the price, what's the height? Looks like it goes from 70 to 20, so 50. The base is 50, so 50 times 50, 2,500. I also need to multiply it by 1/2. It's a triangle, so there I get what? 1,250. Oops, it'll be producer surplus. So these calculations, I think, aren't too bad. We really just find the area of triangles. Okay? Another way to kind of think about this, what is producer and consumer surplus? So the surplus I gain as the consumer is I would pay up to my marginal benefit. That's what that represents. I will pay up to, as long as that marginal cost or the price is less than or equal to my marginal benefit, I'll buy it. So I'll pay up to that point. So if I would have paid 3,000, sorry, I would have paid 4,000, but the current equilibrium price was only 3,000, how much did I benefit? Well, I would have paid up to 4,000, in which case my consumer surplus would have been 0. Because I paid this lower price, my surplus was $1,000, right? Now, if I'm a producer or the seller of a product, the first price I'd be willing to take is whatever my marginal cost is. So let's say my marginal costs were $1,000, or I'd be willing to produce something to the market for $1,000. The price I can receive is $3,000. Well, if I would have taken $1,000, my producer surplus would have been zero. The fact that I can sell it for $3,000, my producer surplus is $2,000. So this range of values in between the marginal benefit of consumers and the marginal cost of producers, any price in the middle there is going to make both of them have some amount of economic surplus. So, any questions on this idea of consumer and producer surplus, economic surplus, before we now see how can the government screw things up? All right, so we now have the government come in, and they can set what we call price and quantity controls. I don't think we'll get to quotas today. We'll focus mainly on price ceilings and price floors. Okay. So the first thing, and then taxes and subsidies, we'll kind of hold off and do that on Thursday. So all of these are going to change economic, producer, and consumer surplus. So everything we talked about up to this point is if we just let the markets do what they want, right? Perfectly competitive markets will end up at that allocated efficient point, or where total surplus is maximized. Anytime the government gets involved, they're going to move the market away from that point. So if that's the point where total economic surplus is maximized, if I move away from that point, what's happening to total economic surplus? It's not the maximum, it must be lower or it's decreasing. So the first thing that we'll kind of talk about today, so that loss of surplus is what we're going to call dead weight loss. Once the government gets involved, we move away from that point where total economic surplus is at. The amount that economic surplus falls, that's what we'll define as dead weight loss. All right, where it's the loss of surplus. So let's think about price ceilings to start out. So I'm going to kind of work through this. We'll kind of jump back to the slides. I told you I was going to forget that I have to use Zoom and not this main thing here. So let's go. There we go. So I'm going to try doing it this way. Okay. So let's say I've got a market. Here's my quantity. Here's my price. Here's my supply curve. Here's my demand curve. Here's kind of the current equilibrium price and quantity. That's my allocative efficient point. I could think about producer surplus is the difference between my supply curve or my marginal costs and the current equilibrium price. Consumer surplus, difference between the consumer's marginal benefit and their marginal cost, the price they have to pay. So I can think about before the government gets involved, here is my producer and consumer surplus. Looks just like the graph we had earlier. Now, once the government gets involved, here's my quantity, here's my price. We've got our supply curve, we've got our demand curve, okay? Now, the old equilibrium quantity was here, and my old equilibrium price is right here, okay? So the government's going to come in, and this, I have an example in the slides, which is set up to be rent controls, which are a good example, and we will revisit that. But another example I was looking at, I know this is more of a historical example. I still think that there are some that are currently set. I tried to look it up yesterday through the USDA, and it's not like they set a price ceiling on. They could set a price ceiling. I believe there are some price ceilings that are set. There's like a medication. This is the one that I looked up and I believe they currently have. It's like for HIV. Like if you have it, it's like to prevent you from dying, right? So what do we think? If I need this drug to stay alive, I'm going to be willing to pay pretty high prices. So the government's like, well, we don't want these companies to prevent people from getting this life-saving drug. So we're going to tell them, look, you can't charge a price anything above this value, okay? So if we institute a price ceiling, just to put some values, let's say the drug was $100. We're telling those companies, you can't sell this product for more than $50. So this is where it gets kind of weird to think about because a price ceiling is actually set below the current equilibrium price. But another way of thinking about this is, what does a ceiling do? It prevents me from going any higher. So if I set a price ceiling here, it doesn't let me get to that old equilibrium price. And that's why it's effective. So if I have this price ceiling past this point, if I think about producers, what would be the producer surplus for every unit in this range? Well, the marginal costs are going to be greater than the price or the marginal benefit. So what's happening for every unit in this range? The producers, if they provide these to the market, would actually be worse off. They'd have negative surplus. So do you think they're going to supply those units to the market? No. So producers, after this price ceiling, are going to set the quantity lower than what the old equilibrium was. So we're moving away from that allocative efficient point because they can charge a lower price. So this is where intuitively, if we think about this, what did the price ceiling do? It lowered the price. So what's going to happen to producer surplus? If I can receive a lower price, my surplus as a producer is going to go down. All right. Price is a good thing for me if I'm producing and selling a good. So if the price is now lower than it was before, it's a bad thing for me. I'm going to lose surplus as a producer. What is producer surplus? The area below price, but above my supply curve. So before, here was my producer surplus. After, it's a much smaller area. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Yeah. Yeah, so let's think about, first of all, if we now have a lower price, what do you think is going to happen to consumer surplus? Price is a bad thing for consumers, so if it's lower, consumer surplus should go up. Now, for consumer surplus, the definition is for every unit that we see produced and sold in the market, the difference between the demand curve and the price. Well, the equilibrium price is no longer the price. We can't get that high after this price ceiling is instituted by the government. So now what is the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to consumers? The area below demand, but above this new price that's being set. So consumer surplus will be the area below my demand curve, but above this new price. So it's the same definition as before, but the shape is going to be a little bit different. Right? Now, the reason why it stops at this quantity is because if this is the number of units provided to the market, can anybody, if someone wants to buy it past this point, who are they going to buy it from? There's no one producing it, so they can't buy it, right? So we're going to see that we lose some consumer surplus from the fact that we're no longer selling some of these units in the market. But notice, what was this area? It used to be producer surplus. It is now consumer surplus. So even though consumers lose a little bit from this price ceiling, they're going to gain a much larger amount. So that's the idea that we're going to see from this lower price, this price ceiling, producer surplus goes down, consumer surplus goes up. Okay. Any questions before we keep moving here? So what is also going to be created? The fact that we moved away from that efficient quantity or the equilibrium quantity, we said that's the quantity where total surplus is maximized. So I should have now what? I'm not at that quantity, so I'm going to have some deadweight loss. Or what is total surplus? Consumer surplus after this price ceiling plus producer surplus after. So what am I now losing? Well, these units are no longer being supplied to the market. Nobody can buy them. This is going to be a loss of surplus or my deadweight loss. So we now have these three areas after a price ceiling. Producer and consumer surplus. Now they look a little bit different than when the government wasn't involved. But we also now have this dead weight loss that's been created. Does that help with the colors at all? I feel like an eye doctor. 1 or 2? 1, 2. 2? Okay. I thought maybe. I didn't realize it was on 1. Okay. So, any questions on this? I'm going to add one more thing in here before we go back to the slides. So, when I lower the price, what should happen, and I can put this on a separate graph if this helps. So, if I was at here, here's my supply, here's my demand, here's my old equilibrium price. Let's say here's my price ceiling. Okay? We said no one is any longer willing to supply past this point. When I lower the price, what's going to happen to the quantity supplied? Lower prices, quantity supplied should be, we're moving to lower points on the demand curve, or essentially the reason why this was the quantity after the price ceiling was because that was now the last quantity that someone was willing to supply this good at. Now, if I've lowered the price, what's going to happen to the quantity that people want to buy or the quantity demanded? It's going to go up. In fact, at this lower price, my quantity demanded is now up here. So what's true about my quantity demanded relative to my quantity supplied? Quantity demanded is higher. So I've created a what? If more people want to buy the good than what's being provided, I've caused a shortage. This also goes to the point with, okay, it sounds like a price ceiling we said it was a good thing for consumers, right? That is true. If I think about this in the context of the HIV drug, if I need this drug and I'm not paying a lower price, am I better off as a consumer? Yes, if I'm able to get that drug. But what have I done? I've created a shortage, or I've lowered the number of units that are available. So if I need this HIV drug, if I'm able to get it, I'm better off at this lower price. But what happens to everybody in this range? They no longer have anyone that's providing that drug. What's going to happen to them? Not good things. If it's an HIV drug, they need to stay alive, right? So by instituting these price ceilings, we do help the consumers who are able to get this good, but there's going to be a lot of people that no longer are able to get it, right? That's a bad thing for them, okay? And that's part of where that dead weight loss is coming from that reduction in quantity, okay? Any questions before we move back to the slides here? Okay, so I've got some other examples here, and one that's kind of a real common example that we see used for price ceilings is rent controls. So in places like New York City, right, we can think about the current rental price of a apartment is something. We can even do this in Bloomington, right? If I think that students can't afford to live in these apartments around Bloomington, which I would argue that the prices are getting relatively high, before I have any price controls here, and these numbers are just to make it easy. Let's say current rent is 1,000, right? Well, if the current rent is 1,000, I can find consumer and producer surplus, right? Consumer surplus is always the triangle on top, area above price, below demand. Producer surplus is always the triangle on bottom, area below the price but above the supply curve. If I now institute this price ceiling, what am I going to do? If I am thinking about building a new apartment complex and being able to charge $1,000, maybe it would have been profitable before. So at that higher rental price, I was willing to build these apartments between 1.8 and 2 million. These numbers are kind of set up more in the context of New York. I'm just putting it in Bloomington so we can kind of think about it and maybe connect a little bit easier. But at this lower price now of 800, now every apartment in this range, what's true about the marginal cost to producers relative to the marginal benefit they get from selling it for that price of now 800? The marginal costs are now greater than the price. So are they going to be willing to supply any apartment in this range to the market? No. So what do we get from this rent control or a price ceiling? We get a lower quantity. We've moved away from that allocated efficient number of apartments. So if we think about producer and consumer surplus is still that shape or triangle on the bottom, the area below the new price, but above the supply curve. So producer surplus is now, it's still a triangle, but it's a smaller triangle, right? Now consumer surplus takes on a different shape because it's the area below demand, but above this new price, right? So here is what used to be consumer surplus and still is. But now consumer surplus goes all the way down to this new lower price. So here, this purplish area will now be consumer surplus, but what did it used to be? It used to be producer surplus. So we've kind of reallocated some of what used to be producer surplus to consumers, right? Lower prices. We've helped out people who need to rent apartments. We've hurt the evil companies that rent them. Right? That's the way that it's probably politically sold. So if I get an apartment here, I'm kind of pissed off if I'm a company because I get less surplus than I was before. But if I'm a consumer, I get even more. Well, that's great. Right? We've helped out people living in this area. We've made it more affordable to live. What's the problem? What happens to these 0.2 million people? Are there any apartments left for them? No. I mean, in theory, we could create homelessness, right? By using these price ceilings. Okay? So it politically sounds great because if I get an apartment, I'm paying less money. And if there's 1.8 million people, I can get 1.8 million people that really want to vote for me. What happens to the other 0.2? I have an apartment. I have a place to live. So what do you think this might create? If I can't legally rent my apartment for anything more than 800, what might I do? Rent it illegally or under the table? And there I might be able to have some market power and actually you can charge higher prices than I would. So through these price ceilings, we are creating deadweight loss in the market. So what surplus did we lose out on from not selling those 0.2 million apartments? Whatever the surplus was before, or the total economic surplus being the area between the supply and demand curve. So we've created deadweight loss, and potentially we've created black markets. Right? People illegally selling this product. Any questions over anything here before we keep moving? Pricing? Not necessarily. I think maybe like in this example, I didn't give you the intercepts. A lot of the times when I'll draw these out, I draw them in a way where it looks like they're equal. But if you think about this, if I have a demand curve and it has a different slope than supply, I'm going to have different areas. We'll work through some examples later on where we see this. Any other questions before we keep moving? And back next class, we'll talk about how the slope of the demand curve impacts what happens to consumer surplus. Yep. So that's price floors, right? What I'm going to do here is change the time on this. So we're at what, 10:13. So I'm going to set this to be, I don't know, 10:23. Save and publish this. You can access this under the quiz tab. Scrolling down, maybe. Or it should be under that module 5 and 6 tab as well. So the code I have set for today is 10.70. Okay? So that should get you into the quiz. Anyone give me a thumbs up if that's working for you? Yeah. So my memory is not completely shot. 10.70. Okay. So this is where sometimes I'm feeling friendly. We'll have it set to be 10:23. So we got about 10 minutes to kind of work through this. We're going to look at this together. Right. So I'm not going to show you the answers. This is where even being in class, you have to pay a moderate amount of attention to what we're doing. Okay. So on this first question, right, we want to give you some practice of actually calculating what consumer and producer surplus are and what deadweight loss is. So here I've got a market, and the old equilibrium or allocated efficient price was 50, and the allocated efficient quantity was 40. I then come in and set this price ceiling and say, you can't charge a price anything above 30. Okay? So if I set this price now at 30, right? What is the value of my consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus should be the area where? Below this consumer surplus, I should be using my demand, the area below demand, but above the new price after the price ceiling. So what that's going to be is this area below my demand curve, but above this new price, but only up to what's the last unit producers are willing to supply to the market. They're no longer willing to supply anything past this quantity of 20. Right? So there I now have the shape of a triangle plus a rectangle. So what's the area of this triangle? The height is 20. The base is 20. 20 times 20 times a half is 200, right? So I've got 200 here. What's the area of this rectangle? Simply the base times the height, or length times width. So the height is what? 40 times 20, or 800. So I define consumer surplus, have the area of this rectangle plus the area of this triangle. 800 plus 200 would be a consumer surplus value of 1,000. So it's just finding the area of these shapes. Once we identify the area, it's simple. I shouldn't say simple, but it's area of rectangles and area of triangles, which I'm guessing if you got into Kelly, you know, shouldn't be too bad, right? So here we've got our consumer surplus. Now the next thing we'll kind of talk about is, let's say I institute the same price ceiling, okay? What's going to happen to producer surplus? And we could calculate this to prove this. So if I now have a lower price than the old equilibrium, what's going to happen to producer surplus? It's going to go down, right? Price is a good thing for producers, so if it's lower, that's going to hurt them. Now we can prove this to ourselves, because what would producer surplus be without the price ceiling? Area below the equilibrium price, so the area below price but above the supply curve. So this large triangle has an area of 40 times, can't quite see the quantity, 40 times 40 times a half. So what? 800, if I'm doing math in my head correctly. Now what would producer surplus after the price ceiling? Simply this smaller triangle, area above supply but below this new price of 30. So 20 times a half gives us 200. Sure enough, producer surplus with this price ceiling went from 800 to 200, or decreased. Also, anytime so there, we didn't even have to find the value. We just know producer surplus decreases. Now, what's going to happen to deadweight loss? Anytime I have what we call, and look at this here in a second, an effective price ceiling, which is all we've looked at up to this point, it's moving me further away from the allocated efficient quantity, or the equilibrium quantity. So what should be happening to the total surplus? Total surplus is going at the allocated efficient point. That's where total economic surplus is maximized. So if I move further away from where something is maximized, I am decreasing. Now the question didn't ask about total surplus, it asked about deadweight loss. What is deadweight loss? The amount of surplus I lose by moving away from this maximum point, or the allocated efficient point. So if the quantity in this market is moving from 40 to 20, it must be that deadweight loss is increasing. I actually have some now, right? And then how would I calculate deadweight loss? It's the area between my supply and demand curve for all these units no longer being produced and sold on the market. So if I instead asked you to calculate deadweight loss here, how would you do that? It'd be the area of this triangle. So the height would be 40, the base would be 20. 20 times 40 is 800. But it's the area of a triangle, so I then need to multiply by a half. So what was my deadweight loss? $400. So I can ask you about directional changes, but I could actually ask you as well to calculate the actual values. Any questions on that before we keep moving? So we just worked through these answers together. I had this set to be 1023. I think the other two, I have set to be worth 0 points because we haven't covered them yet. They're about price floors, which we'll talk about next. So I might jump back into this quiz just to show you how you would answer those questions. You can answer them, but they're set for 0 points, so it won't count against you or for you. The ones that you do need to answer correctly or set for a certain number of points are going to be questions 1 and 2, right? So I kind of have it built in. So if you just answer them, you're going to get 1 out of 2 points for the day. If you answer them correctly, you'll get 2 out of 2 points. Is there any question on that? I hear a lot of talking. Were we not paying attention to working through the answers now? Yeah. So we haven't talked about 3 and 4. We'll kind of revisit these after we talk about that concept. Okay, so listen to my response. The only questions you need to answer here are 1 and 2. Questions 3 and 4 are about something we haven't talked about yet, which is a price floor. We've only talked about price ceilings. So we're going to now talk about price floors. I'm then going to come back to this quiz. You answer what 3 and 4 don't count to them. They're just going to have them there so that we can have them to work through later on. So when you submit this quiz, which you need to do in the next 3 minutes, all you have to do to get the full points is answer the questions we just went through, which is questions 1 and 2. We'll come back and look at questions 3 and 4 after we talk about price floors. Does that make sense? You sit down. Any other questions before we keep moving here? So make sure you're getting questions 1 and 2 answered. Those are the only ones that will be points. You should have it submitted by 10:23. So make sure you're hitting the submit button in the next minute or 2. Otherwise, if it's late, I'm going to assume you weren't here. Okay? Any questions before we move on? Okay? So here's kind of a summary list of all the things that price ceilings will do. If they're effective, they're going to lower the price. We said they're going to cause shortages because a lower price means supply and demand will be higher. Supply is going to be lower. They're moving us away from that allocated efficient point, so they're going to cause deadweight loss. We said they could cause black markets. Wasting resources, essentially that deadweight loss, right? We're lowering economic surplus. Now, one thing we haven't made a distinction between is, are they effective or are they ineffective? Okay. This will be important once we talk about price floors as well. But for now, let's think about, if I can get this to, all right, there we go. So where am I at? Why is this not showing up to me? There we go. So we're going to think about different ranges. And if I had a market up to this point, I've only been giving you examples of effective price ceilings, okay? So if this was the equilibrium price, anything below that equilibrium price, if I set a price ceiling anywhere in this range, remember we said a price ceiling doesn't let me go any higher. So to be an effective price ceiling, we had to set that price ceiling below the current equilibrium. Okay? If the government came in instead and said, here's a price ceiling up here. Well, to put some values to it, if people are currently charging $100 and I tell them you can't charge more than 120, what do they say to me? Okay, I'm not. What you know, what do you want from me? I'm not selling it for more than $120. So what's going to change in this market? Absolutely nothing, right? Because they've set an ineffective price ceiling. Okay, so how could this occur? Well, the government incorrectly kind of looks at a market and identifies equilibrium price wrong, right? So it could be that we initially had a price ceiling set to be ineffective, but probably what's more likely to be the case, and this is where I won't kind of connect these dots in terms of questions, but just to kind of get a more heuristic view of what we were talking about this semester, let's say I had this price ceiling and it was currently ineffective, right? I've set it too high. How could it go from being ineffective to being effective if the equilibrium price went up? So what could cause the equilibrium price to go up? A shift in demand or supply. So maybe some of these price ceilings become effective or ineffective because when they were initially set, they might have been effective. But as supply and demand shift, they might then become ineffective over time unless the government kind of updates them. Okay? So that's why we do have these ranges we're concerned with, because on the books, we might see what used to be an effective price ceiling that no longer is, right? Because things in the market have changed and the government didn't change accordingly. Okay. Any questions before we keep moving? Yeah. Yeah, nothing happens. If the current price is 100 and I tell you you can't charge a price above 120, what happens? Nothing happens, right? They're not, right? The price stays at 100. So what happens to consumer and producer surplus? They stay the same. We stay at that allocated efficient quantity. So any price set above that equilibrium, any price ceiling is going to be ineffective. It's ineffective because it doesn't change anything. Is that? No, because this isn't changing. So at this, the price isn't changing. The price isn't 120. Because if I have a policy that says you can't charge anything above 120 and you're not charging above 120, is that an effective policy? No. So nothing changes, right? That's like if I tell you, I don't know, you can't go run into the wall. Were you going to run into the wall before? No. So what's going to happen? You're not going to run into the wall now, right? It's an ineffective policy that I've instituted. I mean, I guess technically, if people want to run into walls, it would be effective. But do you understand what I'm saying? Like, it's something that no one was charging $120. So telling them they can't charge anything above 100, they weren't. Nothing will happen. Okay. Okay. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. This is where I probably come across as crazy sometimes when I give examples like that, but hopefully it kind of helps that kind of sink in, right? So just a different depiction before we get to price floors, and I'll go through this kind of quick. We've kind of already alluded to some of this. What is consumer surplus if I don't have a price ceiling? Area below demand but above the price. So it'll be what? Area A, B, and E. What is producer surplus? The area below price but above supply. So C, D, F. If I have an effective price ceiling, it needs to be set below the current equilibrium. So maybe I come in here and I set an effective price ceiling. What has consumer and producer surplus now become? Well, consumer surplus is going to be the area below demand but above the price. But remember, with this new lower price, no producer is going to supply anything past this point. So it's the area below demand but above the price up to this new lower quantity supply. So the reduction in quantity when you have a price ceiling comes from the producer side of things. So consumer surplus is now A, B, and C. A and B used to be consumer surplus. A and B used to be consumer surplus. I think I said that correct. But C is what used to be producer surplus that has now been kind of transitioned over to being consumer surplus. Right? Now, producer surplus used to be that larger triangle. I think I had as C, D, and F. Now, what's the area below price and above the supply curve? Now, under this quantity, producer surplus has fallen to just area D. So we have the lower price. Consumers were helped. We took up some of what used to be producer surplus. It's now consumer surplus. Producer surplus has fallen. They were hurt by this lower price. But because producers stop at this lower quantity, the areas E and F represent some of what used to be consumer and producer surplus that was now just lost. If it's lost, E and F would be deadweight loss. Right? It was the loss of total economic surplus. Now, if I was calculating this, right, I could do this with actual values, and we kind of did some of this before, but just to confirm what we were saying before, if I were to calculate these areas before and after a price ceiling. Before the price ceiling, the equilibrium price would be 50, the equilibrium quantity would be 40. Consumer surplus would be the area above that price, but below the demand curve. So what? Height of 40, base of 40, 40 times a half would be 800. All right, so these visuals are kind of what it was after, right? So that's just, don't worry about those, right? How would I calculate this before the price ceiling? Here's consumer surplus, area below demand, but above the price. Producer surplus would be the area below the price, but above my supply curve. So producer surplus would be what? Height is 40, base is 40. Here I started out with an example before I can go into this. Consumer and producer surplus both started out at 800. That doesn't have to be the case. Whoever asked the question earlier, I just had an example here where that, just to kind of prove this point, right? So what happens after I institute this price ceiling? Well, what should happen to consumer surplus if I lower the price? It should go up. So if it was 800, hopefully when I now calculate it, I get a value that is above 800. So after this price ceiling, we said consumer surplus is the area below demand, but above that cost to them, which is the price. So I now have the area of a triangle plus the area of this rectangle. So the triangle's area would be what? 30 times a half. So what? 450 if I'm doing math in my head correct there. What's the area of the rectangle? 20 times 30, so 600. So if I add those two areas up, I get what? 600 plus 450 is 1,050. So what has happened to my consumer surplus? Sure enough, it has increased with this price ceiling. Now, what's happened to producer surplus? It was 800 before. After the price ceiling, where is producer surplus? It's now going to be this green area below the new price, but above my supply curve. The area of that triangle is what? 30 times a half. So that would be what? 450. If I'm doing math in my head correct, right? So sure enough, with this lower price after a price ceiling, what happened to producer surplus? It went down. We can prove this to ourselves working through some actual numbers. Now, what is deadweight loss? Let's say I somehow didn't give you this visual, and I just gave you what's on the right-hand side. How could you tell me what deadweight loss was? Well, how do I find total economic surplus? Exactly. What was my consumer and producer surplus before? 800 and 800. So what was my total economic surplus? 1,600. What is my total surplus after? 1,050 plus 450, that would be what? 1,500. So deadweight loss is the loss of surplus. If I went from 1,600 to 1,500, my deadweight loss should be the difference between those two values, 100. If I had the visual, sure enough, I can calculate the area of deadweight loss here. It would be what? 20 times 10 times a half gives me $100. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting just to point out here, that I haven't mentioned up to this point, what is the base of that deadweight loss triangle? It has an interpretation for this. So what is the base of that red triangle which represents deadweight loss? It's the difference between the old equilibrium quantity and the new quantity after the price ceiling. So the base of that triangle will always be the reduction that we saw in the quantity in that market. Well, where does the deadweight loss come from? It comes from the fact that we're no longer seeing those units between 30 and 40 produced and sold in the market. So that's why that base of that deadweight loss triangle is that range. It's all the units that we lost in this market because of this price ceiling. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So we're going to go through this relatively quickly. I have an additional example we'll likely look at on Thursday as well. But we're going to work through now not price ceilings, but price floors. Okay. So a really common example is minimum wages. We'll look at this next class, but I'm going to set up a slightly different example. So first of all, everything just gets like flipped with price floors. So we'll kind of think about why. So the first thing that I'll kind of give you a depiction of is something we've already talked about with price ceilings, but it works the exact opposite for price floors, right? So if I have my supply and demand curve, here's my equilibrium price. If I were to set a price floor down here, right? Well, a price ceiling said I can't charge a price any higher than this. A price floor is saying you can't charge a price any lower than this, right? I can't go below the floor, right? So if I set a price down here, if the current price is 100 and I tell people you can't charge less than 50, what do they tell me? I'm not. So what would this be an example of? An ineffective price floor. Before, ineffective price ceilings were above the equilibrium price. Ineffective price floors would be something set below the equilibrium, which means, probably could take a wild guess here, if I set a price floor that's above that equilibrium, let's say 120, if I tell you you can't charge a price below 120, and you're currently charging 100, what has to happen? You got to change some things, right? I can't charge that old price that I was. So effective price floors are going to be above the current equilibrium. So if I'm looking at an effective price floor, and this is where I think it helps, I'll try to leave this up. We're going to do a kind of a side-by-side comparison. So we'll start out thinking about, I've got a market, and starting out here, here's that equilibrium price. Here's that equilibrium or allocated efficient quantity. So without any government intervention, I should keep my colors consistent because I was always using blue for consumers. So here's my consumer surplus before the government gets involved. Here was my producer surplus before the government got involved. Okay. So let's instead think about, what is a price floor going to do, right? If I set it effectively, here's my supply curve, here's my demand curve. Okay. If I come in and say, all right, you can't charge a price any lower than this, right? This is my price floor, okay? Now, before we kind of work through the visual, what does a price floor actually do? Compared to the old equilibrium price, we said that price floor is only effective if I set it above the old equilibrium. So if I've increased the price, what have I likely done to consumer surplus? If you have to pay a higher price as a consumer, your surplus is going to go down. Right? If I have a higher price and I'm a producer, is that a good or a bad thing? If I'm selling something, do I want the price to be higher? Yes, so my producer surplus is going to go up. Okay? So if we think about visually why, what is consumer surplus after this price floor? The area below demand, but above this new higher price. So consumer surplus after, it used to be this entire triangle. Now it's this much smaller triangle. Okay? Now what happened to producer surplus? It's the area above my supply curve, but below this new higher price. Now, we're going to see that the quantity stops here. We'll talk about a little bit more why, intuitively why in a second. So here was my old equilibrium quantity. Why now with this higher price does the quantity stop at a lower value? Yeah, for every unit in this range, what is now true about the marginal benefit of consumers for every unit in this range, or where are we at on the demand curve? What is the marginal cost to consumers? This new higher price after the price floor. For every unit in this range, that price or the marginal cost is now greater than the consumer's marginal benefit. So are they going to want to buy any of these units? No. So with price ceilings, the reduction in quantity came from producers. When we have price floors, this reduction in quantity, or the quantity we see after the price floor, comes from consumers. Okay? So regardless of who it comes from, if I now have a lower quantity, I've moved further away from this allocated efficient quantity. What have I created? If total economic surplus is maximized at that equilibrium quantity, if I move away from that point, I've lost economic surplus, or I have created deadweight loss, right? So just like price ceilings, price floors will also create deadweight loss. Okay? So some things get flipped, like, okay, now the effective price floor is a higher price, right? Which lowers consumer surplus, increases producer surplus. That was the exact opposite of a price ceiling. But the things that are consistent is we see the quantity in the market go down, which creates this deadweight loss. Okay? So I'll kind of try to put an example to this idea. Let's say this is the quantity of melt, and here I'm thinking about the price of melt. So historically, there have been price floors on melt. I was trying to look up yesterday if there currently are, and I think that there are, but it's kind of a little bit different. It's like the vast quantities of melt there's a price floor for, but if it helps just for the context of what we're doing, let's think about a price floor instead of like, these huge 1,000 gallons being sold. Let's just think about like the price of a gallon of milk at the grocery store. If the government came in and said, look, you can't charge a price any lower than $3 for a gallon of milk. Why might they want to do that? Who does that help? Higher price helps producers or helps farmers, right? So if a big lobbyist group is the Dairy Association, I might want to appease them. I might choose to use price floors for their product because I know that's going to help the producers of milk. The problem is, what have I done here? Well, what's the new price? Or sorry, at this new price, what is my quantity demanded? Well, remember, this lower quantity was coming from the fact that at these higher prices, consumers were willing to buy less. Quantity demand went down. At this new higher price, how much are producers willing to supply? A much higher amount. So what have I created with a price floor? Not a shortage, but a surplus in the number of units. Not economic surplus, but a surplus in the number of units. So have you ever heard the term of living off the government cheese? Right? Where does that come from? There historically were price floors on dairy products. So what did that create? Surpluses. So we had these quantities of milk products that no consumer was willing to legally buy a higher price. So what did the government do? It took the surplus from these dairy farmers and it gave it away to individuals below it, right? Because they had this huge surplus. So what did they create using that price floor? Deadweight loss. Okay? So who is that good for? Farmers, right? They got that little huge lobbyist group behind them. Who is it bad for? Everybody who is legally not willing to buy, or not willing, they're not able to buy milk now, right? It's not quite the same, but some of the current policies are causing increases in the price of imported goods, and if that's the only goods we have, it's essentially like setting a price floor, which is going to essentially do the same thing. Okay? So just trying to give some current examples or goods that we can kind of relate this to. Any questions on this before we kind of move back to the slides here real quick? Okay. So, excuse me. We kind of talked through this idea of ineffective, effective price floors. We can also think about this in the same way that we thought about price ceilings. Before, what was producer and consumer surplus? Consumer surplus was A, B, and E. Producer surplus was C, D, and F. With a higher price, what is now consumer surplus? It's only area A. So we've seen consumer surplus go down by a lot. What is producer surplus? It's now the area below price but above the supply curve, which is area B, C, and E. So this area in the middle of B is what used to be consumer surplus, but it's now producer surplus. We've hurt consumers with this higher price, which has helped out producers. And then at this lower quantity, right, because of this higher price, that reduction in quantity away from the old equilibrium, these are all the units that were being sold and allowing us to get to this maximum point of economic surplus. But we're no longer seeing these units produced and sold in the market. People want to produce them, but no one's willing to buy them. So the reduction in quantity now comes from the fact that consumers don't want to buy this product or as much of this product as before. So every unit in that range, we lose out on all that surplus or that area in between the supply and demand curve, right? So areas E and F represent what used to be some of producer and consumer surplus that is now just lost. Okay? And we could do the same thing as we were doing for price ceilings. We could calculate producer and consumer surplus before. It's the same graph that I had before. So we start out with producer and consumer surplus. We're starting out at 800. But at this higher price, using this price floor, what should happen to consumer surplus? Should go down. Sure enough, this blue area, or once again, not the technical way of remembering it, but consumer surplus is always the area on top, area below the demand curve, but above that current price. We calculate that area, it's going to be what? 30 times a half, or 450. So consumer surpluses went down. At this higher price, the area on the bottom, or the area below price but above the supply curve, that will represent our producer surplus. So it's the area of this rectangle plus the area of this triangle. So what? 30 times a half, so 450, plus 30 times 20, so 600. 600 plus 450 gives me that 1,050. So the values look the same as what we're doing before. It's just that now those values we saw basically get flipped. With this higher price, we now saw consumer surplus go down, producer surplus go up. But I also like to use the same graph because if we have a price floor or a price ceiling, if we set them the same difference, so just to make this point, the old equilibrium price was 50. When we worked to the earlier example of a price ceiling, it was 40, 10 away from that price. If I set a price floor, 10 away from that price from the other direction, I should get the same changes to surplus. It's just that now the change will be to producers have more, consumers have less. And remember, what did we say deadweight loss was before? We said even if I didn't have the visual, I compared the before and after, it was $100. Sure enough, if I now calculate that deadweight loss triangle, it's the same amount. Why? Because we said the base of my deadweight loss triangle is always the reduction in quantity caused by either this price ceiling or this price. Excuse me. So that should kind of give us, we already talked about binding price floors and price ceilings. It's just kind of being a reminder of that. I'll talk through the minimum wage, but I wanted to just reference, because I did say I would do it, those final two questions. So if I had a price floor here, how would I calculate that deadweight loss? So it would be the area, what's my new quantity after this price floor? Looks like it's 20. So the reduction in quantity from that equilibrium would be the base of my triangle, so 20. The height, I was going from 70 to 40. 20 times 40 is 800. But why is the consumer surplus, why is deadweight loss not 800? It's the area of a triangle. I need to multiply it by a half, giving me the value of 400. And then if I had a price floor set at 30, this is a trick. I could ask you this on the quiz or the exam. If I set a price floor at 30 here, what happens to, I think it's producer surplus and deadweight loss? Stays the same. Why? If I'm currently charging a price of 50, and you tell me I can't charge a price below 30, I look at you and say, I'm not. Nothing changed in the market. Everything would remain the same. So next class, we're going to start with taxes and subsidies. I will then end the class return to this minimum wage example because I think it's interesting, but also just kind of getting more practice with using these price theories, price floors. Other than that, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I've got my office hours tomorrow. Remember that module 6 reading is due at the end of the day tomorrow. Okay. Otherwise, I will see you on Thursday.